In this lecture, we'll be discussing neuroscience. First, we'll start with how the brain and body communicate. We have what we call neurons, which is how the brain will actually communicate with the body, and neurons are cells in your nervous system that will transmit information to the brain. So when you use any of your senses, so sight, touch, sound, taste, these cells will transmit that information to your brain so you can respond accordingly. We then have what we call glia cells. These are brain cells that will provide support functions for the neurons. So the support functions could include removing waste, secreting cerebrospinal fluid, so that's fluid in your brain and spinal column, and helping repair neural damage. Glia cells also help form myelin. Myelin is this fatty, waxy substance that insulates parts of some neurons, and it helps speed the transmission of neural signals. You can think of it being similar to insulated electrical wiring in your home. Now, there's quite a many disorders that form when the myelin sheath actually starts to break down. One of the most common ones we hear about is multiple sclerosis. So that's when the body's central nervous system is attacked, breaking down that myelin sheath. And over time, you'll actually start to develop certain symptoms that relate to loss of motor functioning and coordination. So next we have the anatomy of a neuron. We have our cell body, which contains nucleus and DNA, and hopefully, as you learned in biology class, the DNA holds the genetic blueprint for the development of an organism. And then we have what we call dendrites. These are like little tendrils or fingers sticking off the cell body that receive incoming signals from other neurons in your nervous system. Once signals are received, we'll go down through what we call the axon. The axon is within that myelin sheath we talked about in the last slide, and this axon will help carry what we call action potentials. We'll get into that later on in the lecture, but this is what will convey info from the cell body to the synapse and then to another cell. So that transmits all the way down to axon bulbs. So these are the end of your neuron, and they contain a bunch of tiny little storage pouches that we call vesicles, and they hold neurotransmitters. And your neurotransmitters are going to be the chemical messengers that then carry neural signals. And then it goes across what we call a synapse. And that's basically this connection between two neurons. So the axon bulb of one neuron actually comes into close proximity with the dendrite of another neuron, but they never actually touch. So we'll get a little further into the synapse of a neuron. So we have two things here. We have our presynaptic neuron, which is the one sending the information, and our postsynaptic neuron, which is the one receiving the information. As we discussed in the last slide, the presynaptic or sending neuron is the one that will receive information, and these action potentials travel down the axon that's covered in the myelin sheath and goes all the way down to the axon bulb, which has those synaptic vesicles, which house the neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters go into what we call the synaptic gap. This is this itty bitty distance between the presynaptic neuron, the sending one, and the postsynaptic neuron, the receiving one. Those neurotransmitters will then cross that gap and go into the dendrites of the receiving postsynaptic neuron. So how do neurons even work? It starts with resting potential, which is this potential difference that exists in a neuron when it's resting. So it's not really sending any information anywhere, it's at rest. And ions are really important with this. They're these charged particles that have a role in firing off action potentials or sending those messages. Now they can be positively or negatively charged, but sodium Na positive and potassium K positive are really important. They're those electrolytes you always hear people talking about that you need to function, and this is honestly exactly why. If you look at this graph here, you see the cross section of an axon. So that's where all that information goes through, and it's covered sometimes in that myelin sheath. And when resting potential is there, you'll notice that there's a higher concentration of negatively charged ions inside the axon than there is on the outside. The outside actually has a higher concentration of positively charged ions. So neurons are never at rest all the time. They have their information they have to send to other neurons, which they do with those help of action potentials, those neural impulses that are fired to help carry along that information. To do this though, your neuron has to reach what we call a threshold of excitation. So this is the potential difference at which your neuron will fire those action potentials, and that difference is negative 55 millivolts. And 1 millivolt is 1/1000th of a volt. So when the threshold of excitation is reached, that negative 55 millivolts, ion channels on your axon will open up to allow the sodium ions, the Na positive ions on the outside, to enter into the axon. Now remember, the inside of your axon is negatively charged. So as those positively charged sodium ions begin to enter, it'll make that space positively charged. Eventually what will happen is other channels will open up to allow your potassium ions to come out, which are the K positive ones. As those come out, your neuron will return back to its resting potential, which is actually negative 70 millivolts. And then your neuron will go through a refractory period, which is just a brief period after it fires an action potential that it's inhibited and unlikely to fire another action potential. We also have an all or none law, which states all action potentials are equal in strength. So once your neuron begins firing an action potential, it'll fire all the way down the axon. Next, we'll get into how synaptic transmission works. As we've learned, there's that presynaptic sending neuron, and the action potential travels all the way down the axon to reach the axon bulb, which then releases neurotransmitters into your synapse, that itty-bitty space between your presynaptic sending neuron, postsynaptic receiving neuron. Now, these neurotransmitters released will bind to your postsynaptic receiving neuron's receptors to cause either excitation or inhibition. It is important to note, though, that each type of neurotransmitter has a certain shape, which allows it to bind to specific receptors, just like a lock and key. Now, if excitation is caused, the neurotransmitter will actually make this postsynaptic receiving cell more positive inside, and that'll increase the chance for an action potential to be fired. So this ensures messages continue through the nervous system after they cross the synapse. With inhibition, the opposite occurs. Neurotransmitters make that postsynaptic receiving cell more negative inside, which we know is resting potential, and that decreases the chance for an action potential to be fired. This essentially stops messages from continuing onward. A fun fact, though, is one postsynaptic cell can receive excitatory and inhibitory signals from various presynaptic sending neurons, so the axon will actually add them up, and if the sum of them move the resting potential to that negative 55 millivolt threshold, the action potential is fired because that's that threshold of excitation, and if not, the signal doesn't move onward. However, not all neurotransmitters find receptors to bind to, and they're just floating out there in the synapse, and you don't want them there. So what will happen is a process called reuptake, where they're actually recycled back into the presynaptic sending neuron for later use. Now, the neurotransmitters bound to your receiving postsynaptic neuron are eventually dislodged, and either reuptake occurs or they're broken down by enzymes. We also have neuromodulators. So we know we have our neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers carrying those neural signals. But with neuromodulators, they're chemicals in the nervous system that affect neural signaling without directly changing the resting potential of a postsynaptic receiving cell. It's a much more less direct effect. An example of this is protecting neurons from harmful substances or impacting the release of neurotransmitter. The same chemical can sometimes act as a neurotransmitter, neuromodulator, or even a hormone. There are different types of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. They're not all the same. The first one is acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter related to muscle movement and perhaps consciousness learning and memory. You'll actually see people with Alzheimer's, which is usually associated with degradation of your brain, memory loss, and whatnot. They'll actually experience the loss of these acetylcholine neurons that are being released into their synapses. We also have GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. It is a neurotransmitter and it primarily functions as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this helps regulate arousal or levels of energy and pain. What you'll see with GABA is it might play a role in anxiety and chronic pain, actually. And drugs that increase GABA are used to calm and sedate, such as benzodiazepines, so like Valium or Xanax, or barbiturates. So you'll look at cyclobarbital for sedation, and even alcohol can fall in this category. We also have glutamate, which primarily is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Fun fact is the brain can actually become excited to death. So when there's brain damage that affects neurons holding glutamate, it can be released in such large numbers and spread to nearby neurons, which causes a very large firing of action potentials and brain cell death. And then we also have endorphins. These are neuromodulators and they act as a natural painkiller, very similar to opiates like heroin or morphine, which are part of the opioid family. And they're released in the central nervous system during stress of physical exertion or even injury to block pain messages. And what we know with opioids is they bind to these opioid receptors to reduce pain and become highly, highly addictive. So what you'll see sometimes is it actually does play a role in what we call the runner's high, that euphoric, relaxed feeling. But what research is finding is that endocannabinoids, or molecules similar to cannabinoids in marijuana, actually play a large role in this. So next we'll talk about the structure of the nervous system, and we'll start with the peripheral nervous system. So your peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is basically your entire nervous system except for the brain and spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord are actually part of your central nervous system, which we'll get into later on. But the nervous system does contain what we call sensory neurons and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are what carries information from your external world and internal world to your central nervous system, so your brain and spinal cord, where motor neurons actually carry those signals from the brain and spinal cord to your muscles. So one way to think of it is sensory neurons carry information towards your central nervous system, where motor neurons carry those signals away from the central nervous system. But the peripheral nervous system is comprised of two major nervous systems. So you have your somatic nervous system, which basically controls your sensory and voluntary motor actions. So it allows for deliberate control, where the autonomic nervous system helps control involuntary organ functions and actions in your body. That way you can have more conscious space in the brain to respond to your environment proficiently, because we don't need to be thinking about whether we're hungry all the time, or how do we even breathe, or how do we move. So an example for the somatic nervous system, though, would be maybe you are at the gym, you see a treadmill, so the sensory neurons help carry that information to your brain. So then you make an informed decision about whether or not you want to go on the treadmill, go for a run, go for a walk, or even walk away. So then you are directed through motor neurons to engage in some sort of movement. However, your autonomic nervous system does have two other nervous systems. One is the parasympathetic nervous system, which this helps regulate those involuntary organ functions and actions in the body, other relatively calm conditions. Where you have your sympathetic nervous system, that will regulate your involuntary organ functions and actions in your body under very stressful, threatening conditions. So a lot of times your sympathetic nervous system is actually referred to as your fight, flight, or freeze response. You'll see a lot of times it's actually heightened in people with trauma OCD and anxiety. Now, the catch is you'll actually hear a lot of somatic therapy techniques out there, which basically somatic therapies are where you focus on becoming deeply connected and attuned to your physical experiences so you can work on ways to help regulate those more efficiently. And as you can probably tell, it helps best when people have trauma or anxiety. Now we have our central nervous system, which, as mentioned before, is your brain and spinal cord. In this slide, it's more of just a review, and then we'll get further into all of the different aspects as we go. So we have what we call the forebrain, which contains your limbic system, thalamus, hypothalamus, cortex, and deals with a lot of what we call higher order mental processes. So that's a lot more of the complex thought and cognitions and whatnot. We also have our midbrain, and that connects your hindbrain to the forebrain, hence why it's called midbrain. And then you have your hindbrain at the bottom there. That's your primitive part of the brain, and it composes a portion of the brainstem, and it has your medulla oblongata, pons, and cerebellum. There's also what we call neuroplasticity. It's your nervous system's ability to rewire its structures as a result of experience and learning. It can be positive and negative. Age and environment definitely play a role in this because as we age, our brain structure will start to shrink, blood flow diminishes, and there can be changes in neural functioning that occurs, and some individuals actually develop lesions. So negative neuroplasticity could be experiencing trauma, such as war, and your brain will rewire itself to become overly hyper vigilant to the environment around you when you're no longer in war. So you live in that constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. Your sympathetic nervous system is way too active. Positive neuroplasticity, though, is using mindfulness practices like meditation or other types of therapy to assist your brain in healing from PTSD, as it helps rewire those neural connections and puts you back in a parasympathetic or much more calm state. There's also what we call functional plasticity. So it's your brain's ability to move functions from a damaged area of the brain to an undamaged area. It does have limits though. So if you have damage to areas that are critical for movement, language, speech, cognition, you will experience deficits. We also have structural plasticity. So it's your brain's ability to change its physical structures because of learning. All of this, like we said though, is an ongoing process. And exercise is actually a great way to maintain blood flow and cognitive abilities, which is one of the reasons it's recommended so often for brain health. So we'll start with the hindbrain and midbrain. The hindbrain, like we said, has the medulla oblongata, and that is your basic life-sustaining functions. So we're talking respiration, heart rate, blood pressure. It also plays a role in sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing, and digestion. You also have the pons, so that deals more with consciousness, sleep, dreaming, facial movement, sensory processes, and transmission of neural signals within the brain. And then we have our cerebellum, so that's balance, muscle tone, motor movement coordination. Research does show, though, the cerebellum plays a role in perception, memory, and emotion, and abnormalities are actually linked to depression, bipolar disorder, and ADHD. And then we have our midbrain. In the midbrain, there's this piece called the reticular formation, and that helps regulate arousal, which, as we know in psychology and neuroscience, that's your energy and alertness levels. And this helps assist, of course, in attention, sleep, and consciousness. Now we'll talk about the forebrain, which, as we mentioned before, contains the limbic system. And like we said, it is more for complex, higher order mental processes. And that's because your limbic system mainly deals with emotion, motivation, and memory. And it's comprised of your hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. So we'll start with the amygdala. This plays a role in fear and aggression and how we perceive and respond to emotion-evoking stimuli. Individuals with autism spectrum disorder actually have abnormal amygdala activation, size, and pattern of neural connections, which is why it makes it difficult for them to perceive emotions sometimes. This also really helps us understand social situations, though, and regulate our emotional reactions. Otherwise, we might end up in dangerous situations because we're not able to tell what would be positive or what would be negative. We also have our hippocampus, which plays a role in transferring info from short-term to long-term memory. Studies suggest that the hippocampus is larger for individuals who consistently perform tasks involving spatial memory or your ability to remember where things are located and how they relate to others, such as taxi drivers. We also know stress can shrink the hippocampus, but it's more complex. Having a smaller hippocampus is associated typically with mental health issues like PTSD, but studies are suggesting that initially having a smaller hippocampus predisposes you to mental health issues. We also have our thalamus, so that helps playing a role in the attention we give to things that stimulate our senses and then relays information coming from our senses to our brain. It also assists in rapid eye movement, or the REM cycle of sleep. And lastly, we have our hypothalamus, so that maintains homeostasis, or that internal state of equilibrium in your body, by helping monitor and regulate body systems and functions. It will also motivate us to engage in certain behaviors to assist with that. So when we're hungry, it motivates us with hunger cues, or when we are sleepy, we are motivated with sleep cues. Now, your forebrain also has cortex and lobes. The cortex is that crazy, wrinkly outer part of the brain that you typically see, and this deals a lot with thinking, planning, language, interpreting sensory data, and coordination of sensory and motor information. We have our temporal lobe that's part of this, and that assists with auditory processing and languaging. Your occipital lobe in the back helps with visual processing. The parietal lobe is more for touch and cognitive processes. Less is known about this region, so they're still doing research on it. And then you have your frontal lobe. That's for thinking, attention, planning, decision making, problem solving, judgment, language, motor movement, and aspects of personality. Now, if you remember in some past lectures, we actually talked about Phineas Gage. He was the railway worker who suffered brain damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is in that frontal lobe of the brain. So because of this, he actually had issues with impulsivity, emotional regulation, making judgments, and executing behaviors. Now, within the forebrain, the lobes of the cortex do have some specialty areas. The first of which is Broca's area. That's in the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for speech production. There's a thing called Broca's aphasia, which is where damage to this area causes a person to be unable to produce speech. Next, we have the primary motor area, again in the frontal lobe, and that is for execution of motor movement. Going to the parietal lobe, we have the primary somatosensory area, and that's for sense of touch. In the occipital lobe, we have what we call the primary visual area, so that helps process visual information. And then in the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area. That's for speech comprehension. And there's another thing called Wernicke's aphasia, where similar to Broca's aphasia, if there's damage to this area, a person is unable to comprehend speech. And then we have our primary auditory area, which is again in the temporal lobe, and that helps process auditory information. So now we'll talk about the hemispheres and lateralization of the forebrain. So cerebral hemispheres are basically the brain is split into a left and right side. And you have what we call lateralization. So that means functions of your brain are only found in one hemisphere or one side. So right and left sides of the brain control different functions in the body. But that leads to what we call contralateral, where the right brain controls the left side of the body and the left brain controls the right side of the body. The left brain is more associated with language, logic, analytical thinking, where the right brain is more associated with creativity, visual processing, emotions, spatial reasoning, and intuitive thinking. I'm sure we've all heard of this idea that we're either left side dominant or right side dominant. That's actually a bit of a myth because both sides of the brain work together to accomplish tasks, or they'll perform complementary functions. Research, though, does suggest that lateralization of the brain is graded. So that means it gradually occurs as we develop. So the functions only found in one hemisphere will start to develop as we develop. We also have the corpus callosum. So that's this thick band of neurons that connects the right and left hemispheres, or right and left side of the brain, and it passes info back and forth so each side can work together. What we find, though, is men have larger brain volume but smaller corpus callosum, where women have smaller brain volume but larger corpus callosum. Brain volume, though, is not an indicator of intelligence, nor is the size of your corpus callosum. For example, the density of certain regions and aspects like white matter, which actually help process info, and gray matter that helps with communication between brain regions, also plays a role. Plus, genetics, environmental factors, and so forth can also play a role. It's not really fully clear what these differences mean between males and females, so more research is needed. But we also have this idea of a split brain. It's a brain with a severed corpus callosum. There was a split brain experiment example where if you present an object to someone's right peripheral field of vision, that information goes to the left side of the brain, where we talked about Broca's area is actually located, the part responsible for speech. So this person can actually name the object. If you present an object to someone's left peripheral field of vision, that information goes to the right side of the brain, and this info cannot travel to the Broca's area, and therefore the person cannot name the object. So now we have our endocrine system. The endocrine system is this style of communication in the body that is much slower but has long-lasting effects. And it's slower because it relies on your cardiovascular system to transport what we call hormones, which are the chemical messengers that your body will use to affect organ function and behavior. Now, the hormones are produced and released by endocrine glands, and when they release them, they obviously will go into the bloodstream. But things like sexual activity, sleeping, eating, and growth are affected by your hormones. And your internal organs actually have receptor sites to receive these hormones. Now, the hypothalamus is very important in the endocrine system because it will send signals to your pituitary gland when the endocrine system is needed for something. And your pituitary gland is basically this master gland in your limbic system that will control and regulate hormone release in all the other glands in the body. So a common one we hear about is the thyroid. That regulates our energy use. And issues you can have with the thyroid could be Hashimoto's disease, where your immune system actually will start to attack it. You have hypothyroidism, which is an underactive thyroid, and it will reduce your metabolism. And you have hyperthyroidism, where it's overactive and the thyroid will speed up metabolism. We also have our adrenal glands, which regulate energy and sexual behavior. So your adrenal cortex will produce what we call adrenal androgens, and it's found in males and females, and that'll help control sexual characteristics, physiological functioning, and interacts with your immune system. And we also have the adrenal medulla, so that's inside the adrenal gland, and it releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, or adrenaline, when the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. An issue you can have with adrenal glands is called Cushing's syndrome, which it's an adrenal gland disorder that causes issues with cortisol production. So that's what is released when we are stressed, and it can actually lead to mood issues. And next we have gonads, which basically affects your sexual reproduction by producing sperm in males or eggs in women. And you have ovaries or testes. So women have ovaries, and that will produce estrogens. It's that female sex hormone regulating aspects of sexuality. It is found in both males and females. Women just have higher levels of it. Where in men, they have testes, which produces androgens. And it's the male sex hormone regulating aspects of sexuality. but again, it's found in both males and females. Men just have higher levels of it. An issue you can find in this, though, is PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and that's found in women, and it will cause irregular periods, infertility, weight gain, and cysts on your ovaries. But it is important to note that anything within the endocrine system can actually cause issues if something's off, and those issues can look very similar to mental health concerns such as depression, anxiety, mood swings, and so forth. So last, we have some tools that help us study the brain. We have a very common one we hear about, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, and that looks at your brain structures. Positron emission tomography, or a PET scan, looks at brain activity. Functional MRIs look at brain activity and brain structures. An electroencephalography, or EEG, that looks at patterns of electrical activity in the lobes of your brain. Brain stimulation is actually parts of the brain are stimulated to see cognitive and behavioral reactions. And then you have what we call a computerized axial tomography, or CAT scan, and that looks again at brain structures. So usually this is what people will use, either one or a few together, to help you study the brain.